You are listening to a Hebrew in Israel production with your host, Yoel Halevi. For more details, you can go to HebrewInIsrael.net, and you can also support these recordings by going to the donation section. These recordings are brought to you free, with no charge, to educate and teach you as much as possible on the Torah, Tanakh, and other subjects. Okay, today is the 17th of July. Today's also the 18th day of the 4th month. I almost said the 14th month, which is a postponed, belated fast in the rabbinic calendar. The belated fast of the 4th month, relating to the prophecy in Zechariah 8, the question that was sent to him by a group of people about fasting. Really, they actually asked the question about fasting on the 5th month, but the prophecy is actually layered. There's more than one prophecy there, and it goes from the 5th, and it adds the 4th, and then we get the 10th and the 7th, or something like that, which shows us that the prophecy itself is not really one prophecy. There's different stages in what happened, and I think the prophecy itself indicates this, that there's more than one story there. Let's see here. It's actually chapter, in the Hebrew, it's chapter 7. Let's see this for a second. It starts in chapter 7, and then the prophecy continues on into chapter 8, which is kind of interesting. There's a gap between the prophecies. A man called Bet-El, Shar-Etzer, Regem Melech, and their men, they seek God in the temple, and they ask, do I have to fast? Do I have to continue fasting on the 5th month? And he says to them, their community has been, it doesn't seem to be this is one individual. It seems to be this is a community of people. They're fasting for the last 70 years. So this has to be the end of the 70 years. This relates probably to the prophecy of Jeremiah. At the end of 70 years, the 70 years of Jeremiah are over. Do I need to continue fasting or not? Now, so the question I have to ask myself, first of all, is this even connected to the existence of a temple or not? The answer actually might be a little bit surprising. In the original question that they asked, the answer is yes, it's connected to a temple. Fast started off when the temple was destroyed. And then for 70 years, they fasted. Now, within this period of time of 70 years, a lot of things changed. One of the things that changed was that even before the 70 years were over, they already had a partially functioning temple. By asking this question, do I need to fast on this era? The question is really framed within the prophecy of the 70 years, not in the question of is there a temple or not. That's a really, really intriguing thing. But what the prophet answers is equally intriguing, because he says in verse 6, "V'chi tochlu v'chi tishtu," when you eat or drink, "Halo atem ha'ochlim v'atem ha'shotim," you're the ones who eat and drink. Says, what I care about is what I said to the early prophets, the first prophets, Nevi'im Rishonim, which is kind of interesting, because when we use the term Nevi'im Rishonim, we're actually referring to the book of Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. But when he's talking about the first prophets, so really what he's saying here is the earlier prophets. He's really talking about the prophets that came before him. This is what the term Rishon and Acharon, earlier and latter, but not end or the first ones that exist. So why the term the end of days is also an incorrect term. Acharit Yamim is the latter days. It's not the end of days. In the Bible, we don't really find this concept of the eschaton, the end of history, the end of days. In Dead Sea Scroll literature, we do find this concept, which is quite intriguing by itself. But he basically says to them, what I really want from you, I want you to change your ways. So he goes over the standard formula that we find in other prophets about treating the weaker people in your society proper and so on. He's saying, no, don't think that if you're going to fast and then the next day commit crimes, that I'm going to forgive you. So it's not really about the fasting, it's about changing your ways. But what's very intriguing about this is that the way the material here is edited, the prophecy about this specific question is split in two. And what happens is that we get the rebuking of the people of why the temple was destroyed, why they went into exile. And then we get another prophecy that's inserted in what we call chapter 8, from verse 1 all the way to verse 8, where there's a future promise of returning everyone else. I was very angry, now I'm bringing you back, and so on. And there's going to be great, elderly people are going to sit in the streets of Jerusalem, and so on. And I will be a God to them with truth and righteousness. And then verses 9 to 13 relates back to the current era, where he's basically saying, strengthen your hands, because you're going to hear these prophecies. And he's referring to himself, to Haggai and Malachi as well. And he says, the ones who are here right now, don't worry, everything is going to be great, everything is going to be fine. You go into, it says in verse 13, as you were cursed amongst the nations, the house of Judah and the house of Israel, thusly I will redeem you, and you will be a blessing. Do not fear, let your hands be strengthened, because this is an era, when we think about the Persian era, this is a quite complicated period, because what it meant that not only did they only have their own governance, the government itself, the kings kept on changing their minds. When you read the first 6 chapters of the book of Ezra, there is a temple, there's no temple. It's like a roulette with these kings. Some kings are nice, some kings are bad, and so on. But because of this flip-flop with these kings, he has to give them this prophecy about, don't worry. But as time progresses, and it seems to be this is what's going on, because the question of the 70 years, if we say the first temple was destroyed, say in the common reckoning in 586, and 70 years have passed, so it's the year 516, there are 20 years after the declaration of Cyrus. And if we correlate this with Haggai, this is around the same time of Haggai, where Haggai is saying, you're not building the temple. So this person asking this group of people, this community is asking this question, is looking at the reality of their time, around the year 516, to the usual calculation that we have. And then we have the 70 years are over, but yet the temple's not really built yet. Do these two things go hand in hand? And the response is, not necessarily. You have what's expected of you to do, which is to build a temple and treat each other with righteousness. And then, as Haggai says, from God's side, he will bring all the blessing. So what happens is, the 70 years are over. They're looking around saying nothing's actually happened. Nothing has really changed. There is an altar, but Jerusalem still stands desolate, and it'll probably take a few more decades before they rebuild the walls and so on. It depends how you calculate when Nehemiah came over, and what's the relationship between the time of Nehemiah and the time of Ezra. Was Ezra really before Nehemiah, or there's maybe a deception here that maybe Nehemiah came before Ezra, because when Ezra shows up, the city is kind of pretty much standing. When Nehemiah, when we read the description of Nehemiah, the city is in ruins. So there's this common theory of the reconstructing this period that Ezra actually came after Nehemiah. It's just the books got flipped because of the different structures. The first book, the book of Ezra, deals with the earlier history and then jumps forward 60 years. And then Nehemiah is really supposed to be somewhere in the middle, because these are technically two separate books. The book of Nehemiah is all the memories that Nehemiah had. This is all material that he recorded in his, basically what you would call his private journal of what happened. You couldn't mix, the two materials weren't mixed into one another. So we had a book that dealt with the return to Zion from the Cyrus Declaration all the way to Ezra, with elements from the time of Nehemiah in the middle without directly referencing Nehemiah. And then we have the journal of Nehemiah, which is from the same period, but you actually have to insert it in the middle. If you read it this way, then there's the whole question of, was Nehemiah able to change some of the practices amongst the people living in the area? Was he able to stop people from marrying foreigners? Was he able to really influence the region, or was he actually doomed to fail? And when we read Ezra, it seems to be that they're doomed to fail. It seems to be that this was part of the problem, and nothing really changed. Which, by the way, takes when we think about him saying, treat each other with justice. No matter how you read it, Nehemiah is quite a while after the base prophecies of Zekharyah. And therefore, when Nehemiah shows up, Nehemiah is still dealing probably with the same issues that Zekharyah is talking about. So when Zekharyah tells people, be strengthened, don't worry, he's still talking when there's hope. But when we move forward, when we look into the prophecies, especially verse 17, it says, you each seek in your hearts the evil upon one another, and you love taking oaths in vain. All these things which I hated you do. And then in verse 18, he basically describes, says, the fast of the 4th and the fast of the 5th and of the 7th and the 10th will be to the house of Judah for rejoicing, and so on. When you read this, you're going like, wait, we have this wonderful prophecy about greatness of Israel, and then we go back to this, you're doing bad, and then suddenly at the end of this sequence of prophecies, we have this prophecy about more fasts. So there must be a time lapse here. The original older practice, assuming the original older practice that we have in this prophecy is of the 5th month. But as time progressed, and maybe more groups came into the region, maybe from Babylon or from Syria or from Egypt, or little other groups came up with the same question, some commemorated on the 5th, some commemorated on the 4th. There seems to be, at least it seems to be, there's some time lapse here. And by this time lapse passes, the base prophecy about you fast for yourself becomes irrelevant because people didn't change. So the prophet is saying, okay, fast. But these fasts eventually will turn into good because there's always hope. There's always this will that in the future everything will be much better. So this still meshes very well with the idea of the hopeful future, the goodness of the future. And this is how you can understand verse 18, because verse 18 really meshes very well with verse 9 to 13, where he's expecting the future to be better and bright. But going from one fast to 4 fasts either is a time lapse, or that the question raised other communities that asked similar questions about other practices that they had. My sense is, because of verse 17, there was a time lapse here. And the more time progressed and things didn't work, the more fast people added. By the way, the fast of the 7th is probably a reference not to the 3rd day, or which was really the 1st day, but the 3rd day, what we practice the 3rd day of the month, the 7th month, which is referred to as the fast of Gedaliah. In the future will become the feast of Gedaliah. This is probably in relation to the 24th day of the 7th month mentioned in the book of Nehemiah, when they gathered after Sukkot to fast over everything that was going on. So this is a completely different construction. But what's interesting is how Rabbinic Judaism kind of took all these fasts and kind of did with them other things. Like, for example, Tzom HaRevi'i is in the 17th of what's called Tammuz, even though the destruction of the breaching of the city was actually probably on the 7th of the 4th month, not the 17th. The 17th was the breaching of the city in the Second Temple era. So they said the Second Temple destruction was worse because and truthfully we have to admit the exile of the Second Temple era was much longer, but it was just it perpetuated the exile of the First Temple. The exile of the First Temple never really ended. We're still technically within it. The destruction of the Second Temple is just another event within a much larger catastrophe. But that was the decision, and then the fast of the 5th month is technically either the 7th of the 5th month or the 10th, but for some reason we do the 9th, somewhere in the middle. The 7th month is, as I said, probably originally was the 24th. Today we do the 3rd, and the 10th is probably the only one that still remains in its original date, which is the 10th of the 10th. That's the only one that really sits in its original date. The rest of them got moved around because of the Second Temple era. But what's intriguing about this is that in the beginning, he basically categorically says, I don't need you to fast. He's not saying don't fast. It's your prerogative to fast or not. And what's interesting is that, if I'm not mistaken, Maimonides, but I think he bases this in another source, Maimonides says that in the Second Temple era, you had a choice. You could fast on these 4 fasts or not, because the temple was standing. And then eventually, when the temple was destroyed, then it became everyone had to fast this. But if we read the original question was in relation to the prophecy of the 70 years. So in truth, the prophecy of the 70 years said that you will return. The temple wasn't completely standing. Therefore, he's telling them it's all up to you. They opted to continue. So you can argue, based on the fact that they continued, then everyone who had this practice was obligated to continue this, even though there was no actual prophecy that obligated them. Several decades down the road, this practice became so common that the prophet, again, goes back to these fasts and basically says, fast them, because this has become the common practice, which is an interesting question about practices becoming a kind of like law of some sort. I wouldn't say complete law, but some kind of a sort, some kind of a practice. How does he use this term? He uses kasher asiti kazeh kamesh shanim. I've been doing this for a while. They've been saying we've been doing this for a while. It doesn't mean that this practice started the moment the temple was destroyed. It seems to be that this group may have returned or was always sitting in the land. They saw that the temple was being reconstructed. As I said, this is probably around the time of Haggai, 20 years after the declaration. This person or people were sitting wherever they're sitting, and they're expecting things to happen. Nothing's happening, so maybe we need to add something to our practices. They start fasting, and now they're asking. They're not going to a rabbi or they actually do ask a Kohen here. It's interesting that the priests and the prophets are presented as two legitimate, equal people to ask about such a practice. And what he says here is that he said he nazer. It's from the term nazar, which is to prevent oneself. It also says he's not talking about a specific day. He may have actually lamented throughout the entire month as well. We're not even talking about fasting. Okay? He's basically saying, Hinazel, I'm preventing myself from things. When you go to verse 5, then we hear the term Hatzom Tzamtuni Ani. Now, are you fasting for me? And here we start talking about fasting, actual fasting. Yes, David? Mm-hmm. You're asking a completely different question from what I'm going into, but yes, it seems to be that is a Kohen and a prophet equals here. So first of all, a Kohen and a prophet are presented in a few places in the Torah as, I don't know if the term is counterparts, but they kind of have somewhat similar functions within at least some parts of the Israelite community. Usually, when you have what we would say a Torah question, you would go to a priest. But here, because it's in relation to the prophecy of the 70 years, that's probably why we have these the prophets presented here as well. Because the priest would say, maybe from the perspective of law, if you have this practice, then we need to ask the question of, is this an oath? If it's an oath, if it's a neder, as you would refer to it, so a vow, not an oath. You have to be very careful with the terminology. If it's a vow, then the priest will be the ones to determine, is this a vow that you're obligated to, in the sense of, if the vow had a condition within it, up to a certain period or something like that. The discussion can become completely, as we would call it today, halachic. What are the conditions of the vow? Did you put a time limit to the vow? Is the vow really in relation to what's going on now, or has the reality changed and therefore the vow is void? So that's where the priests are irrelevant here. But the prophets, I would argue, are relevant because of the question of, have the 70 years passed? How does this relate to the prophecy of Jeremiah? And that's probably why both of them are mentioned here. But I did in the teaching I did on the problem with prophecy, I do deal with the question of the relationship between prophecy and priesthood, and especially some of the issues that come later on about the Urim and Tumim, and how do you check a false prophet? And there's a thing called the Apocryphon of Moses, which is an attempt to explain what do you do with a false prophet, do you check a false prophet or a suspected false prophet based on the Urim and Tumim and so on. It's actually on the website. What you do, just look for it. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, you're well, I actually don't think that's what's going on here. So just to repeat the question. So, you have two authorities here. Both authorities have the same equal say within the same law or question. Then if they disagree with one another, then you just pick and choose wherever you feel fit. So I would argue that there are two things that maybe could be said to you, maybe even three. First of all, that they were probably sitting together as one committee, not as two separate authorities, but they were actually sitting together as one, if I may use the anachronism, Sanhedrin, even though the term doesn't exist. It doesn't exist for at least another several hundred years. But they're sitting together. The other side of it as well is probably because there's this understanding that a priest has some kind of, dare I say, divine inspiration of some sort, a lack of a better, maybe there is a better term, I just can't think of one right now, that the expectancy is that if the prophets work together with the priests, then the prophets can confirm what the priests have through their, what we would call Ruach HaKodesh, the so-called Holy Spirit that gives them the ability to answer. Because we do find this concept of a Kohen being like a Malach, like Malach Adonai. So you do find this idea in some places. But what you're asking is a really important question, a problem that does come up in the Second Temple era, which is what do you do if you have competing authorities? Do you pick and choose the one that you want, or do you go the one that really is the authority? So in the way this developed, it's kind of interesting, because when we look at the splits within Judaism at the time, what happened was you went with whatever stream was the one you were used to. So if you were a Sadducee, you went to the Sadducees, to the leaders of the Sadducee community. If you were a Pharisee, you went with the Pharisaic line. If you were a Essene, you went with the Essene. If you were a local person who had their local teachers, you went with the local teacher. By the way, this is the reason why, for example, the activity of Yeshua or Jesus or whatever you want to call him in the New Testament is so controversial, because at this era, if you were a Galilean, you were expected to stay in the Galilee and just teach in the Galilee. There was a concept of rabbinic autonomy. And what that meant was when a rabbi or a teacher or a preacher or whatever came from a different district, they were entering someone else's autonomy, and this was frowned upon by everyone. If a rabbi from Judea would go up into the Galilee, he would be frowned upon as well. So the thing is that there was this, they did develop this autonomous system within the different Jewish communities, but we're talking hundreds of years later. During this period, we probably would find that in this religious leadership, there were probably priests and Levites and prophets and elders, and they all sat together for the better of the entire community. So even if you had rival groups, they still all sat together on this committee, because they also tried to take care of their own communities, which fits very, very well into what happened, for example, in Athens. This is a period where democracy was something that was introduced into the Eastern world as well. And the basis of what you would call the Forum of Judea, which becomes what they call Knesset HaGdolah, the Great Assembly, and then eventually into the Sanhedrin, is based on this idea of the forums they used in Athens. The only difference was that the demos didn't always have a word in it. The demos was always, the community was always told what to do by the leadership. So it's also not really true that Athenian democracy was real democracy. It was kind of a democracy. It's not like democracy that we have today. But what's interesting is during around the same era, Athenian democracy was going through a process, because they had the rise of the new wealth, which were the people who were not landowners, were actually seafarers. And by the end of the 5th century, which is literally this era, if we're talking about 5th century, so the Persians have several wars, the Battle of Marathon, the Battle of Thermopylae, and so on. They have all these wars, what's called the Greco-Persian Wars. If you want to read about them, you just open up. I've got so many Greek names in my head right now, and he's the father of history. I forget his name, which is it's a complete shame that I forgot his name right now. My brain's going to Thucydides, because Thucydides is the real father of history. But everyone goes to this other writer, Herodotus. Yes, took my brain a moment to get there. Thank you, David. Herodotus is considered to be the father of history. But what's very interesting is that the rumors of what was going on in Persia were reaching this region as well. And I think someone had the brilliant idea going like, well, we're all different communities here. There's these exiled communities, there's the local communities. Within the exiled communities, there are these people who came from different areas, from Syria, from Babylon, from Egypt. We have within the local community, we have people who came from one place, came from another place, and so on. In this era, what we call Samaritans was still acceptable. The split from the Samaritans probably took much longer than the story we read here. The enemies of Judah and Benjamin are probably very specific people within the Samaritan community, but the Samaritans probably split off from Judah somewhere around the 2nd century, beginning of the end of the 3rd century, beginning of the 2nd century. Probably the big split really probably happened somewhere around the the Hasmonean Wars, because they wanted only one temple, so they went to Mount Gerizim and destroyed what was before that perceived as a legitimate temple. The whole question there we might have to discuss maybe some other time. And what happens is this idea reaches this region. So they probably said, let's gather all the different leadership groups and put everyone together and make a grand forum, a grand committee, where we have all these different groups being represented. So this may explain why we have these priests and these prophets sitting together. But it's interesting, he doesn't ask the elders. There's no question here to the forum or to the committee or the elders or anything. Because again, the question really does relate to the criteria of the vow and the question of the 70 years, the prophecy of 70 years. So this one is, probably this is why they're the addressees. But it wouldn't surprise me if the other people sitting in this forum were actually also presented this question. But it's interesting, first of all, he goes, if we break this down section by section, he just says, I prevented myself, hinazer, which is a term which is mostly understood as being just self-prevention, taking a vow of like Lent. He's preventing himself from things that bring joy, so he's eating simple food and so on. But he also says, B'chodesh HaChamishi. This can be very general. This can mean the entire month, or this can mean a specific day in the month, or a specific period in the month. What's interesting is in rabbinic practice, in basically Jewish practice today, the 9 days or the week of, really in the tractate of Ta'anit, the week when the 9th of Av appears, you're supposed to prevent yourself from different things, and practice develop into not eating meat and not listening to music and so on. So this seems to be very general, but when we go into verse 5, it refers specifically to fasting, but God says, I don't care about these things. This is all up to you. What I care about is what I said to the prophets when Jerusalem was sitting in peace, meaning prophets like Isaiah, I would argue mostly Isaiah, but probably also Amos and Hosea. I want you to treat each other properly, but you wouldn't listen. One of the fascinating ideas here is that he's basically saying, I've already told you what you need to know. Okay, the message I personally take from this one, and this has been the message I've taken for years now, is that if I want to know what God wants from me, I don't need to go outside there seeking for a prophet. I don't need to seek a prophet now. I mean, if we treat prophecy, for example, as we find in the book of Samuel, as a type of oracle, Dvorah is a kind of oracle, and Shmuel is a kind of oracle, and we find Elisha is pretty much an oracle as well. There is this element, as Professor Nissanen puts it. He says the one of the earliest occurrences of prophecy within the Israelite culture, if we ignore people like Moshe, even though Moshe also has a function of an oracle sometimes, says when we look at the description of prophets in the earliest stages of the Israelite presence in the land of Israel, prophets are mostly perceived as oracles, as some kind of charismatic oracles that give people answers to their questions. Even later on, Huldah is technically an oracle as well. She's a prophetess, but she's also an oracle. You go up to her and ask the question, what does God want from me? But that's something completely different. The place of the oracle, it's kind of interesting, holy men have taken. Holy men and women have taken. So people go to this rabbi or that rabbi or this spiritually advanced individual of some sort. I'm trying to also use like general terms. So in churches you have these people that have the spirit, presumably, or whatever. In Islam they also do practices. There's like actual soothsaying practices that you I remember once seeing one in the Bedouins. If someone's accused of stealing, they burn the inner lower lip, and based on how it burned, I've actually seen a video of it done. They'll determine based on that who's the thief, and it's very arbitrary. I don't like that guy. Okay, I'm going to say he's the thief. It's very similar to the whole idea of looking at reading someone's palm of their hand, or reading tea leaves, or coffee marks in a mug, and so on. Yes, David. Oh wow, that's horrifying. Oh wow, so you're saying they would use electrical shocks to determine enough? Well, that's horrible. Yeah, we don't do stuff like that. But you do find this principle of trying to find answers through different means and so on. But what's interesting here is that it goes into this fasting, and then, as I said, he describes all the iniquities, and then he gives them this wonderful prophecy about the future. And then he says, I wanted to do, as I plotted to zamamti, from the root zamam, to plot against someone. That's probably the same term in Deuteronomy, edim zomimim, the term to plot against someone by giving a false testimony. He says, I plotted against you, now I'm plotting to do good with you. But then eventually when we reach verse 19, it says, Tzom HaRevi'i, now you have all these fasts, and everyone has to fast them, and they'll be to the house of Judah, Beit Yehuda, everyone in Judah has to fast this fast, and so on. And this is probably indicative of the reality that after several years, or maybe even decades, the prophet turns around and says, you remember that question you asked me a very long time ago? Yeah, the answer is these are all full-blown fasts, and everyone now has to fast them. So there have been people who kind of lingered over the beginning of the prophecy in chapter 7, saying, well, God says, I don't need this fast. And I think that's still true, because the message is you need to repent. But verse 18 seems to slightly contradict this interpretation, even though I'm not saying this is 100% sure. But it feels to me that by the time this prophecy came through, it became so common for people to fast that the prophet is saying, yeah, this fast is necessary. You need reminders. So what's the reason to fast now? It's supposed to function as a reminder of what needs to be corrected. So every couple months there's a fast reminding you, repenting your ways, because if you've ever seen people where they get pumped up, you need to be reminded every once in a while. You need to have like a pep talk, or every once in a while you need to do something to remind you of the purpose of why you're doing what you're doing. If it's every day, or every a couple days, or every week, or every month, we need reminders. And this may be the reason why the prophet is saying this. He's saying, look, it's not really about the fast, but the fast is a very good medium to gather everyone together to the street and remind everyone in public to look at one another. Because if, for example, in your community there's someone who's not doing right with others, for everyone in the middle of the fast, turn around to that person and say, are you now reminded what you need to do? There's some peer pressure here as well to fix the community. The problem is that today, Isaiah says, "Vayiruni mitzvat anashim melumada." They fear me like just the rehearsed practices of men. It doesn't mean according to the laws of men, as some translations sort of presented. Mitzvat anashim melumada is the way people have been indoctrinated to do things. You've been taught to do it this way and not in any other way. I was watching, for example, this afternoon, this question about indoctrination, the problem with, how certain things are indoctrinated into our thoughts, financially and socially and so on. This person was trying to analyze this and saying, I'm not here from a paranoid perspective or anything. This is actually a very calm person, very down-to-earth person. But what they were trying to say is, if you actually examine, just be a critical thinker for a moment, you will find, even if you ignore conspiracy theories, you will find things that indoctrinate people. And, so it kind of made me wonder, because everyone was having a problem with this Buzz Lightyear movie with a small gay kiss, which I agree. First of all, the Toy Story franchise is garbage. It's not even interesting. I've never watched it, but I got someone actually sent me a snippet of this. A friend of mine said, a snippet. This is what everyone's having a whole thing. And then I asked, and then I actually watched the new Thor movie, and it's way worse. It's way worse. Okay, there's a lot more of it there. I'm not hearing anyone in an uproar because everyone's having an issue about this because it's indoctrinating children. But really, in truth, who are the people who kids also watch the Thor movie, okay? Even if, say, they're 12 years old, they're still very impressionable. But in any case, I'm digressing into a completely different question here. Also, by the way, Stranger Things. They just came out with, first of all, I hate that show. I watched one season and I wanted to vomit. It was so bad. Playing off of the whole nostalgia of like, oh, it's set in the 80s. I literally don't care. Okay, there's a really funny show here in Israel called The 80s. That's a show worthwhile watching because it really makes fun of living in the 80s here in Israel. Okay, it was funny. It's a secular show, but it represents the truthfulness of living in Israel back in the 80s. I was watching it. It was hysterical. I'm sitting with my kids and my wife and I were just like, this is exactly what our lives look like because this is literally, this show was set like 10, 15 years before the world started moving to the digital age. When I tell my kids you had to walk around with like a type of coin to use a phone because there were no cell phones. When I tell my 12-year-old there was no internet back in the day, this is a kid that was born into the internet era, deep into the internet era. And I tell him there were no cell phones. It didn't exist. Back in the 90s, really rich people had these cell phones that were only for calling. It's things they can't even imagine. But what's very interesting about this is that, going back to the main point, is that we do need to stop and think. We do need to kind of look inwards every once in a while as individuals, which is something we can do every day. And look inwards and ask ourselves the question, are we doing what's right? And what's very interesting is there's people asking about Jewish meditation. Is there such a thing as Jewish meditation? And I usually avoid answering this question, but I can actually say here, there is such a thing as Jewish meditation. Jewish meditation is not about sitting and being all spiritual. It's because I've had people try to take like these Eastern these Eastern practices, yogi practices and Buddhist practices and whatever practices, and kind of give them like a Jewish twist, which is not something new. People have been doing this for a very long time. But when people ask you what is really Jewish meditation, the answer is this. When you read Jewish sources, like for example, my first exposure to this question would be through the Ramchal, Rabbi Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, who lived in the 17th century, 17th, 18th centuries. He talks about this concept of meditation in the sense of take time every day to sit and think about your day. It's decompressing from the day, but also thinking, did I walk within the path that I want to walk in? Did I treat others with justice? Did I let others treat me with justice? Have I found what God wants from me? Because really, what is peace? Peace is not just running away from the noise. Yes, I agree. One of the realizations I've come to is that I'm not in my 20s anymore. And today, I have to have quiet every once in a while. We change. And so there's always the issue of adjusting. But for us as individuals, yes, that's what we need to do as individuals. We can sit every day because we can turn that into a practice. The same way the Torah says to us, you have to meditate about these words every day, or you are to recite these words when you're up and when you're lying down and when you're walking in the street and so on. It's not about mumbling words as you go, okay? It's to live and practice this concept. It's the shinun here is not just the mumbling of the words. It's the concept of also living these things as you go throughout your day. So if we don't live these things as we go throughout our day, then obviously we can't correct the things that the prophet is talking about here. This obviously in return leads to the need of a public ceremony, what we would call peer pressure. because this peer pressure is quite important, because it allows the community to turn within itself to flush out the problems. And it doesn't have to be violent. All it has to do is, like, everyone stands in front of the community. The people who are causing trouble eventually know what they're doing, and they might actually turn back and say, I need to repent, and I need to fix my ways, which will lead to a much better structured society. Because when we talk about prophecy and overall, most prophecy deals with the question of, are people treating one another correctly? There's this really interesting question of, what is prophecy for? And when it really boils down, we go to Malachi, and Malachi says, Zichru Torat Moshe Avdi, remember the law of Moses, my servant. At the end of the day, it's just to uphold Torah. True, people were using them as oracles as well, because that was a very common thing back then as well. But at the end of the day, the concept is to upkeep Torah. But to upkeep Torah, you have to have a society that's willing to live with one another. When people are not willing to live with one another, then there's no way of living Torah. You can live Torah within your household, which is what Joshua says, what Yehoshua says, Ani uveiti na'avod Adonai. As for me and my home, we will serve the Lord, is the famous lyrics, words that were turned into lyrics. I'm very iffy about turning prophecies and verses in the Bible into songs. I don't know. If it's an actual song, then I can understand it. But I get kind of iffy when people take verses. Sometimes they even take the wrong verses. There was a very popular song back in, I think, in the 90s from Isaiah 41, and it was when I actually read it in context, I was like, this is not the words you want to sing. This is actually not good. But this happens quite a bit. But in any case, just to wrap up this entire discussion, because it's very appropriate for today, if we want to live Torah, we also have to live Torah as a society and not isolate into ourselves and say, well, as for me and my home, we'll serve the Lord. Yeah, but how about everyone around you? When Joshua said this, he's basically saying, no matter what happens, I'm going to be loyal to God. But he's not expecting people to suddenly walk away and say, you know what, okay, you said it. As for you and your home, you'll serve the Lord. We'll just do whatever we want. He's not saying that. He actually cares. He's a true leader. He actually cares for the people, and he wants them to serve God. He doesn't want them to turn away. But I've seen people use that verse to say, well, I don't care what society does. So what kind of if you perceive yourself as one doing the word of God, and you're the one doing the right things, then with all due respect, you perceive yourself as someone who could potentially be a leader. If you could potentially be a leader, how about you do something about it? There's a certain kind of like cop-out when you say, well, I'm going to do what's comfortable for me and the rest of the world can explode. No, if there are other people like-minded out there, then you need to seek them out. If you're in the middle of nowhere and there's no one else like you and so on, yes, that's a problem. I understand that, because I speak on a regular basis with people who are in the middle of nowhere. There's nothing else out there for them. So they're by themselves, and many of them are miserable, and I feel their pain, and I don't have an answer for it, by the way, unless I tell them move, but where are they going to move to? To a Jewish community that may or may not accept them? There's some questions about how Jewish communities are functioning as well today. I get to hear these stories that make me wonder. But at the end of the day, Torah was given to all of Israel, which means it's given also as a society. In a time of crisis where no one's doing Torah, I can understand why you just turn into yourself. But there's this fatalist mentality I every once in a while bump into, of people who just think they're the only ones out there, and therefore they just fold into themselves and everyone becomes the enemy. I don't think that's healthy either. I think that not only it's not healthy, I think it's actually very dangerous to practice that these days. And I think the other problem is that there are people who try to feel as if there's a sense of community. And I've also met like Hebrew roots teachers who try to create a feeling of community, so they corroborate with other teachers and so on. Or you see these rabbis who they'll have these summits where they sometimes even bring hundreds of rabbis in for this summit. But do the rabbis go back and tell their communities we have to strengthen within ourselves, but also strengthen our connections with other communities? I don't know if they do that. I have this thing that makes me wonder if people, as David, for example, brought up earlier about, are there different, can you just pick and choose wherever you want to go to? First of all, there is a problem today because if you seek out a rabbi outside of your community, is it possible you're putting a wedge within your community? That if you live, like for example, I live in a town with tens of thousands of people. I don't know everyone in this town. There's no way on earth of me knowing everyone in this town. So I belong to a synagogue, and the synagogue has a rabbi. So this rabbi is the rabbi of, say, 50, 60, 100 families. In a really large synagogue, it will be several hundred families. So that's the rabbi. You go to that rabbi. That's your little community. We do exist in a reality that's completely different than what it used to be. Because today a Jewish community could be composed from dozens of smaller communities. But, for example, when we had a threat against our town itself, suddenly everyone joined together. Suddenly people from different neighborhoods within my town joined together to deal with this threat, with this problem that was developing. That's a sense of community. But I sometimes just wonder if this message is always sent out. I've been talking about the concept of unity for several years now. As I've said before, I wrote a paper about the sense of unity back in the day, during times of King Hezekiah and King Josiah, trying to bring the northern tribes. Yes, true, what they were trying to do is bring all the tribes under the house of David, but on the other hand, there was this concept of unifying everyone so we all do things together, have a sense of being one nation. But today, what's happened over many centuries of autonomy that each leader had and so on, today I think this sense of unity doesn't exist anymore. And this is why, for example, fasting today is on the one hand a blessed thing because it reminds the entire nation and anyone who feels connected to the Jewish nation. It joins everyone together to the sense of we have to fix things. But do we really internalize these things? Are we really reading the rest of the parts of the prophecy where he says you need to change your ways? Or are we going to wake up tomorrow morning saying, okay, we fasted, onwards with life? It's like the whole thing with Yom Kippurim. When Yom Kippurim comes around, people for a couple of days are all very God-fearing, but then it dies away. And I can testify this about myself as well. You're all very fearing the couple of days after Yom Kippurim. And then it kind of dies out because that's how nature is human beings. These fasts are the national upkeep. So if you're debating if you should fast or not, I would relate this to, does it have a national effect or not? The question really starts as a small community asking this question, but then eventually it becomes the house of Judah. So we're receiving a different I'm assuming we're receiving a different interpretation of what this fast really means. And if this fast morphs into what I think it morphs into, it no longer becomes this small group of people who are living somewhere in the Jerusalem area fasting over the destruction of the temple. But, like for example, the sons of the Rechavim who stepped away from society, and then Jeremiah deals with them. And he tells them, well done, you're doing the right thing. And they're loyal, they listen to their father and so on. This thing morphs into a national level fast. If this has morphed into what I think it's morphed into, then the question now is, are we doing anything with this? Do these fasts have any meaning now? I don't think it's connected. Let's put this. I think it's connected to the temple because we have the element of the 70 years. But today, if we see it morphs and it morphs into keep your society in check, are these fasts relevant? If we detach it from the temple, and I would answer yes, these fasts are extremely relevant. With the rise of media and how influencers of sorts, people who barely have an education, who do videos on this notorious TikTok thing, I forbid it in my house. My one of my sons has this thing about TikTok, and I gave him a very, very long lecture about the logical implications of what he's doing, the moral implications of what he's doing, the dangers of it. And as far as I know, I also monitor his phone. Unfortunately, he's only like 12 years old, so I have to be a parent, a very nosy one. But we have to start within our families, and it has to spread out. So are these fasts relevant? I would say with a temple, without a temple, I think that these fasts are relevant because it solidifies something that they were doing also in the first temple era, which was to fast. As for example, we see in Jeremiah to call the fast, and then everyone would gather in the temple, and Jeremiah would give his prophecies. But what it's done, it's institutionalized in a much more organized way the concept of fasting. If fasting originally was a random thing, except for Yom Kippur, it was a random thing called upon by an authority like a prophet or the priests or the king or someone within the administration of the Israelite world, this institutionalized it because the realization came, we haven't changed. And in truth, as an historian, we haven't changed. We're still doing the same stupid things that we did in the past. And also saying this is an Israeli. You would think that, we came back to our homeland and so on. We're still harming one another. We're still being violent to one another. So if you ask me about these fasts, I think they're relevant. I don't think we have to be as strict. If we catch someone eating, let's stop beating them up. No, heaven forbid. For example, people who are sick, people who fasting is dangerous for them, then no, don't fast. For example, I'm a diabetic these days. My fasting on these days is limited. If I feel well enough to do it, then I do it. If I'm too sick, then I don't. And it's some diseases are touch and go. Sometimes you have a good day, sometimes you have a bad day. So to kind of wrap all this up, I think that the fasts are completely relevant nowadays. I think the original fast was connected to, the original practice was connected to mourning around the temple. But we are talking about an era where the temple wasn't standing, but also they didn't have their own autonomy. Today we live in our own autonomy, but there's no temple. So this again raises some questions for me about, if we have our own autonomy, but there's no temple, does the question rise up again? Because they were in the same kind of the same situation. There's kind of a temple, but there's not really a temple, but there's an autonomy. And God says, I don't need to fast for me. You can fast. You're fasting for yourself. What I want you is to change. But then on the other hand, I would argue in favor of keeping these fasts because of the reality that we're still very violent to one another. We don't have a temple. There are things which haven't been fixed yet. This is all just the destruction of the first temple just continuing on to this very day. And now we're not really mourning the second temple. We're just mourning the entire concept of us being completely unable to live with one another, unable to keep the covenant, which as a result also leads to our physical and spiritual destruction. So as a society, these fasts as a public concept is actually quite healthy. It's a memorial of sorts. We need these ceremonies. We need these practices. Yeah, sure, I agree. They're not commanded in the Torah. But I think that I know that back in the day, one of the things that existed was local or practices and ceremonies that people would create for their own personal needs. So calling to a fast by an authority was something that they did do. So today, this has been solidified as a practice for the last 2,500 years. And, as long as we don't fix ourselves, the fasts are relevant. But again, because this fast started as a practice, you can be more lenient about them, which is, by the way, how Judaism practices it. We're more lenient because this is not really a commandment anywhere. This is even in the second reference to the fast in chapter 8 verse 18, he's just referencing this as a common practice, not that there's a law. So I would say from a public perspective, I think it's relevant. On a personal level, it's probably up to you. Yes, David. Is there an intentional... does it relate intentionally to Bilam and Balak and so on? I think there is I think it is there. I think that there's the original reading, for example, in the land of Israel was once it finished the Torah every 3.5 years. So they probably could pace themselves even more to fit the reading and so on. On a larger scale, I think the fitting is a bit more difficult. But I think there is someone who says that there's a correlation there. I mean, for the Haftarah, it's very easy because the Haftarah is you just choose the one that fits the time. So we now have the three of the Puranuta, the three of the destruction. But we can. I think there's a little bit of a connection there, but I don't know how big the connection is. I think someone has pointed out that connection. I don't remember exactly what the details are. Other comments or questions? I originally wanted to continue with the Book of Judges, and then someone intrigued my thoughts about this, and I said to myself, let's talk about this subject. Not you, David. Actually, someone else. Someone here, but someone else. But yeah, it is a very intriguing question, and I think that framing this question correctly is very, very important, because it's not a law. It's what we would call minhag, but the minhag becomes acceptable. But we also have to drive into the purpose of this minhag, this what we would call man-made law. What is the purpose of it? If the purpose is no longer there, then can we remove it? Today, for example, Orthodoxy wages wars over practices that sometimes are admittedly probably not relevant to us anymore. But because of the importance of the war against reformism, then even silly things get preserved. But here I think that the prophecy does solidify the idea of why are we fasting, and gives a very, very good explanation. Yes, it is connected to the destruction and so on, but there's a larger picture here. Why was the temple destroyed? This is again the thing about what happens with the 9th of Av. We mourn the destruction of the temple, and that's the focus. But even rabbinic literature does remember what the prophet says here. It reminds us that the temple was destroyed because of sinat chinam, unjust hatred. People hating one another just because they can hate them. That's because they're looking for an enemy. Some people have a psychological problem that they're looking for an enemy all the time as well. I've dealt with this question before. It's quite an intriguing one as well. But what's most important here is to remember that when we get up and walk out the front door, we need to love our neighbor as ourselves. Instead of focusing on is there a temple or not a temple, we need to focus on why isn't there a temple. Go beyond the base concept. Go beyond the base idea. I disagree with someone. It doesn't make us enemies. We need to dialogue these things. Now, true, if the person is abhorrent, this person is doing things that, whoa, we need to hit the brakes and say, that's it, and put societal peer pressure on this person. I think that as a society, at least in the Western world, and I include Israel within this, we do seek justice. The problem is that there's also people of interest, people with money and interests and so on. So they'll tell you that they're trying to help justice, but behind, in the back door, everyone does justice to themselves. So you can have a person saying, well, I'm seeking truth, justice in the Torah way, and then when you kind of look behind the curtain, you discover this person, there's a few things that they're not doing, which are completely, if you excuse my Persian, kosher. Okay? My Aramified Persian, kosher. Because the word is kasher, but in some dialects of Hebrew it's kosher, and then we add a diphthong in the Germanic diphthong o, so kosher. That's actually how you reach the word kosher. It's a Persian word with a specific dialectal element in Hebrew with a diphthong that, actually, to be more precise, it's a diphthong that we actually also see in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So it's quite possible that there were people who said kosher, or kosher, as we would say today, kosher in some periods in biblical Hebrew. It's an interesting thing. I've been looking at this for a couple of weeks now about how if we can find more dialectal elements in the different ways things are spelled in different locations. But in any case, the thing is that at the end of the day, people do justice to themselves, and sometimes people do justice, which is the justice in their own eyes, and sometimes that justice is actually not justice. We need to measure everything we do. We need to always ask ourselves the question of the why. Now, we can't spend too much time thinking about the why, but as I took a philosophy class during my undergraduate, and we were studying different forms of philosophy in the Age of Enlightenment, and I really liked one very interesting philosopher called David Hume. And David Hume was an empiricist. He basically looked at reality and then said things and said what he thought. But at the end of the day, he sometimes would just step back and say, well, I said all of this, but I'm just going to carry on. Because if we overthink, then we won't do anything. If we underthink, we'll do it wrong. We have to find that place where we're comfortable enough with the reality that we're in to make a decision, even though we know that decision is not always 100%. And we will be judged sometimes for these decisions. And sometimes we can do something that we can prove from every aspect that it was completely kosher that we did it. But then someone will come in and say, but, and they'll run some kind of an argument. The fact that they run this argument, first of all, it doesn't mean that they were in the same situation as you were, and they might be interpreting the situation differently. But at the end of the day, we also sometimes have to step back and say, look, we can't deal with things in an absolute way. The philosophy of absolute thought is also very, very dangerous. So we can never win everything. And, this ideal of, everything will be turned, everything will be built, God willing, will happen, but only happen if either God directly intervenes and completely changes human nature, or we decide to change ourselves. Which is also something Judaism has discussed, and this is why I keep on telling people, look, for years I had issues with rabbinic Judaism. Today I kind of look at it from a completely different perspective, and I understand it has some very, very important insights. And this is why rabbinic Judaism enforced these fasts, even though people sometimes miss why these fasts exist. But rabbinic Judaism enforced these fasts because they understood, the rabbis who enforced this understood the importance of the societal level of why we fast. If you have to eat and you eat quietly in your home, you're not harming what's going on outside. If you need to eat, you eat. But if you understand the message, that's what's mostly important here. And this is why the prophecy cuts in the middle, and he talks about the iniquities. And then he says, but if you correct yourselves, all the good's going to happen, then these fasts will not be even relevant. I can continue on and on this tangent, but that's basically what I have to say about this subject. Comments, questions? Oh, wait. There's a question here. First of all, David says, studies on the TV show Will and Grace. I remember that show. I remember there is such a show. I don't know if I'm thinking about the same one. Okay, anyhow. Show that it's done more to normalize homosexual lifestyle than almost any other factor in the USA. Adults get indoctrinated too. Will and Grace. Isn't that a show about a gay guy who gets married or lives together with a straight woman for some reason? Wasn't that back in the 90s or something? Yes, I remember they used to broadcast that show on like Channel 3 here in Israel or something like that. I don't think I watched it much, but I remember there was such a show. Anyway, Taylor says, I'm familiar with the 9th of Av being a full fast, but are the other fasts different than the 9th? Yeah, the other fast, like 17th of Tammuz, what they call 17th of Tammuz, the fast of the 5th, the fast of the 4th, and the 7th, and the 10th, these are fasts which are only from dawn to dusk, or from dawn to the stars coming out. So here in Israel, for example, it's almost over. The sun sets like 8:01 now, 8:01 in the evening. So the sun set about 13, 14 minutes ago. A couple of minutes, it should be declared as over. But it only really started somewhere before dawn. So I'm gonna guess somewhere around 4:30 in the morning or something like that. When the sky starts lightening up, because I think the sunrise is like 5 something. So maybe 4:45 or something like that. Any other questions? I'm going to take that as a no. So I'm going to wrap this up. Today was the 17th of July, 2022.